My name is Sarah. I live in New York, and I need to share something that happened to me recently. It was such a frightening event that it still makes me tremble just thinking about it. It all started on a morning like any other. I was on my way to work, walking through the busy city streets. People were rushing by, cars were honking, everything seemed normal. But then, I felt something strange, a sensation that I was being watched. I looked around and saw a man standing on the corner, staring at me. He looked ordinary, wearing a dark coat and a cap that hid part of his face. Initially, I thought it might just be a coincidence. After all, it's New York. There are people everywhere. I tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling and continued on my way. In the following days, I began to notice that man more often. He was always nearby, no matter where I went. At the cafe where I usually have my breakfast, he was there. When I left work, there he was again, across the street. Even at the gym, the place where I feel the safest, he appeared. With each encounter, my discomfort grew. One night, I was coming home later than usual. The streets were emptier, and the silence was disturbing. I felt that same chill down my spine and looked back. There he was, following me again. His gaze was fixed, penetrating, as if he knew something about me that I didn't. My heart raced, and I tried not to show panic. I quickened my pace, feeling the adrenaline rushing through my veins. I finally got home and slammed the door behind me, quickly locking all the locks. My breath was heavy, and my hands were shaking. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that I was overreacting. But the feeling of fear wouldn't leave me. I knew deep down that that man was deliberately following me. It wasn't paranoia, it was real, and my instinct screamed that I was in danger. As the days went by, the feeling of being watched intensified. I could no longer ignore it. It was as if a shadow was constantly around me, a shadow in the form of that man who didn't say a word, but whose gaze seemed to want to tell me something sinister. I was leaving home for another day of work, and the gray New York sky seemed to reflect my mood. As soon as I stepped down the stairs of my building, I felt that familiar sensation of eyes watching me. I turned slowly and saw his figure across the street, leaning against a lamppost. He was wearing the same black coat, and his face was partially hidden under the cap. Our eyes met for a moment, and I felt a chill run down my spine. In the following days, I noticed that he not only appeared in the places I frequented, but also started showing up near the places where my friends and family lived. My fear turned into terror. I felt invaded, vulnerable. He knew where I was, who I knew. It was as if he had mapped out my life. That's when I decided to talk to my friends about it. A dinner that was supposed to be a relaxing time turned into a tense meeting. I described the man, his behavior, how he always seemed to know where to find me. My friend Emily, who is more skeptical, tried to reassure me, suggesting that maybe he was just a secret admirer. But the worried look from James, who has always been like a brother to me, told me he also felt something was very wrong. I went home that night with a heavy heart, my mind spinning with all the possible explanations. Who was this man? What did he want with me? I didn't know, but with each passing day, the fear grew, along with the certainty that I needed to do something about it. On a damp Tuesday afternoon, as a light rain fell over the city, I sought some comfort in the Corner Cafe, a small refuge I always frequented on darker days. Sitting by the window, I watched the slow rhythm of raindrops sliding down the glass, trying to lose myself in the soft sound they made as they hit the ground. That's when he appeared again. He entered the cafe with a naturalness that almost made me question my own paranoia. But then, he made his order and, choosing a table, opted for the one exasperatingly close to mine. My heart raced, each beat of thunder echoing in my alert mind. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched him. He was disguised as a regular customer, but there was something in the subtleties of his movements that gave away his true intentions. He didn't speak, didn't look directly at me, but I felt the weight of his presence, like a dense, cold fog. His attention, though disguised, never stopped enveloping me in an aura of subtle threat. Forcing myself to stay calm, I grabbed my phone and, under the pretext of checking a message, managed to discreetly take a photo of him. My fingers trembled, and fear made me question every movement, but I knew I needed something concrete, a visual record I could eventually show to the police. After a few minutes that dragged on like hours, he got up and left the cafe without looking back. The tension in my shoulders only eased when the door closed behind him, but a sense of vulnerability lingered. As soon as he disappeared from my sight, I took a deep breath, trying to expel the fear that had settled inside me. That photo, though a small step, meant a lot. It was the materialization of my fear and proof that I wasn't imagining things. I knew this wouldn't be the end. It was only a matter of time before he resurfaced. But now I had something, evidence. I was determined not to let this cat-and-mouse game continue indefinitely. I had to act. I needed a plan. I wouldn't let fear dominate my life. After that disturbing encounter at the cafe, I realized that my life couldn't continue with that forced normalcy. The circumstances demanded drastic changes, starting with my daily routines. With a heavy heart, I decided to start varying my routes to work, avoid places I regularly frequented, and change the timings of my usual activities. I hoped naively that this would be enough to shake him off. In the first few days, the strategy seemed to work. There was no sign of him, and a sense of relief began to settle in me. Maybe I thought he had lost interest or at least lost my trail. However, this hope was short-lived. On a cloudy morning, I chose an alternative route and took a subway I rarely used. I was almost convinced that my new strategy was working when, as I looked up, I saw him again. He was there in the same car, disguising his interest in a newspaper. The shock of seeing him there, so close, made my stomach churn. His persistence was frightening, and his presence on that subway was a clear message that simple changes in routine wouldn't be enough to get rid of him. From that moment on, my life turned into a constant calculation. It was like playing a game of chess where every move needed to be meticulously planned. I began informing only my closest friends about my plans and the places I intended to visit, keeping everything else as unpredictable as possible. Additionally, I reinforced the security of my house. I installed security cameras at strategic points and replaced the locks with more advanced models. Every time I left or returned home, I conducted a thorough check to make sure I wasn't being followed. The tension of living in this constant state of alert began to take its toll. My nights were restless, punctuated by nightmares and jumps at the slightest noise. Anxiety became a daily companion, eroding my ability to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. I often wondered if I would ever be able to resume my normal life, free from the fear that now haunted my every step. Despite everything, my determination to fight and regain control of my life did not waver. It was a daily battle against fear and oppression, but a battle I was determined to win. I knew the road would be long and perhaps lonely, but I was ready to face it, no matter the cost. That night was wrapped in an almost tangible silence, as if the very air was holding its breath. After an attempt to maintain normalcy, meeting a friend for dinner, I found myself walking back home, heart heavy with the burden of constant vigilance. The chill of the night blended with the cold running down my spine, a familiar feeling now, the foreboding of being followed. As I turned onto my street, a quick shadow between two parked cars caught my attention. My pace instinctively quickened, turning into almost a run. The sound of my own footsteps pounding against the pavement seemed too loud, almost like an announcement of my arrival. When I finally reached the door of my building, my hands were shaking so much that I could barely fit the key in the lock. Once inside, I quickly locked the door and leaned against it, trying to stabilize my breathing and calm my racing heart. The light of the full moon filtered through the curtains, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls of the hallway. My survival instinct compelled me to check each room meticulously, ensuring I was alone. Only after this check, still under the effect of adrenaline, was I able to pick up the phone to call the police. With a still trembling voice, I explained to the dispatcher that I suspected I had been followed for weeks. I described the man and previous encounters, my voice growing in urgency. As I recounted my fear, an abrupt sound from the backyard cut through the night silence. Something or someone was out there. Moving silently to the kitchen window, I peeked through the curtains. The weak street lighting was enough to reveal his figure, now trying to force the window open. "He's here, trying to get in," I shouted into the phone, panic evident in every word. The operator remained calm, instructing me to keep my distance while help was on the way. I took refuge in the bathroom, the only room without windows accessible from the outside, and waited, listening to the sound of sirens growing in the distance. The minutes that followed seemed to stretch indefinitely. My temporary refuge in the bathroom felt like a cell, every external sound a potential harbinger of horror. Finally, authoritative voices and the noise of footsteps in the backyard announced the arrival of the police. He was found still with his toolkit in hand, including items clearly intended to facilitate illegal entry. As he was handcuffed and taken away by the police, a wave of relief and exhaustion hit me. From the window, I watched the end of that terrifying scene, feeling a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The nightmare seemed to be over, but the shadows of that experience would haunt me for a long time. That night, while the police were finalizing the arrest procedure in my backyard, I was locked in the bathroom, trying to control the trembling in my hands and the erratic beating of my heart. Fear still coursed through my veins like ice, despite the growing relief at hearing the firm voices of the officers outside. They knocked on the bathroom door, announcing it was safe to come out. With hesitant steps, I opened the door and faced two officers who looked at me with a mix of concern and professionalism. "It's all right now, ma'am. He's in custody," one of them informed me. The words were comforting, but my body still reacted to the adrenaline of the recent terror. They led me to the living room, where I could see the man, now handcuffed and under watch, being taken to a patrol car. He didn't look at me, his eyes were fixed on the ground. It was the first time I saw him so vulnerable, so human, and it shocked me almost as much as his relentless pursuit. One of the officers started asking questions. I described the entire series of events, from the first encounter to that night. Every detail I could remember seemed crucial, a piece of the puzzle that might explain why he had chosen to follow me. As I spoke, a mix of relief and exhaustion flooded me. It was as if, by verbalizing what had happened, I was finally beginning to process the trauma. An officer mentioned that the man was carrying several suspicious tools, which could indicate plans to break into my house. The thought of how close he came to carrying out his intent sent chills down my spine. "We'll need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement. This could greatly help the case against him," another officer explained. I nodded, knowing that anything I could do to ensure he wouldn't do this to anyone else, I would do. The reality of the situation still felt surreal, but I knew it was just the beginning of a necessary process to regain my peace and security. With the man now in police custody, I felt a chapter of my nightmare closing, but I also knew that the path to emotional and psychological recovery was just beginning. I was determined to face whatever came next, armed with truth and justice by my side. After all, no one should live in fear, haunted by the presence of a stalker in the shadows. The morning after the incident, I woke up feeling the weight of the previous night like a dense fog in my mind. The sun was already shining outside, but inside me, the shadows of the night still clung tenaciously. I knew the day would be long and, in a way, decisive. I walked to the police station with firm steps, but inside, a storm of emotions swirled. Upon entering, I was greeted by a detective who led me to a small, austere room to take my formal statement. The walls seemed to absorb every word, every detail I recounted of what had happened. I described the man, the encounters, the growing fear, and finally, the night he tried to break into my house. The detective listened attentively, taking meticulous notes as I spoke. It was then that he shared some information about the man. His name was David Loomis, and it wasn't the first time he had been involved in suspicious activities, though nothing as serious as what happened with me. I learned that he had a history of obsessive behavior, which only heightened my unease. After the statement, I was informed about the protective measures that could be implemented and the process that would follow. The prospect of a trial was intimidating but necessary. I was assured that he would be kept in custody until the trial, which gave me some relief, but the sense of vulnerability persisted. Leaving the police station, the fresh morning air wasn't enough to clear the heaviness I felt. Everything seemed different now. The city I loved now had a new face, one I wished I had never seen. The walk home was reflective, each step making me think about how things could have been different, how I could have noticed the signs earlier. This incident transformed me in ways I was still trying to understand. Vulnerability, fear, and resilience intertwined within me. I knew that the journey ahead would be as much about emotional recovery as it would be about seeking justice. But one thing was certain, I wouldn't let this event define who I am. I would fight to regain my peace and ensure that my story was heard, so that perhaps, in some way, it could prevent this from happening to someone else. The following weeks were a whirlwind. As the trial date approached, each day felt like both an eternity and a fleeting moment. I often found myself lost in thought, reflecting on the events that had turned my life upside down. When the trial finally arrived, it was a cloudy day, the sky heavy with dark clouds that seemed to echo the turmoil in my heart. Sitting in the courtroom, surrounded by the low hum of conversations and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. I was ready to face David Loomis, the man who had threatened my peace and security. When he was brought into the room, handcuffed and with a grim expression, a chill ran down my spine. Seeing the person who had been just a menacing shadow in my life, now in flesh and blood, being judged for his actions, was surreal. I listened intently as the lawyers presented their cases, each word of the testimonies and arguments resonating in the tense silence of the courtroom. The prosecutor detailed each incident, every moment of fear I had lived through, and the defense lawyers tried to paint a picture of a confused and misunderstood man. But the evidence was undeniable, and the testimonies, including mine, weighed heavily against him. Finally, after hours that stretched like days, the jury retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. I clung to the hope that justice would be served, that the streets I walked would once again be places of freedom, not fear. When the jury returned, the silence that followed was almost palpable. Guilty, the judge declared on all counts. The relief I felt was immense, mixed with a wave of emotions that left me almost breathless. Tears welled up in my eyes, not just from relief, but also from profound emotional exhaustion. Leaving the courtroom, I felt as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I knew the road ahead would still be challenging, that recovery would take time, but that verdict meant I could begin to heal, to rebuild my life on more secure foundations. Now, looking back, I see this experience as a testament to my strength and resilience. I am no longer the same person I was before this ordeal, but I am wiser, stronger, and more determined to live my life fully, without fear. This incident, despite its terror, taught me the value of courage, justice, and the human capacity to overcome adversity.
For those who had the courage to stay until now, I have prepared another horror story based on real events. Now, enjoy the bonus story, Shadows of Fear, Amy's Silent Stalking.
My name is Amy, and what I am about to tell happened just a few months ago. I still have nightmares about it. It all started very subtly, almost imperceptibly. I worked for a large company in Chicago, and at first, it was just a job like any other. I remember the first strange gift that appeared on my desk. It was a rainy Monday, and I was late as usual. When I arrived at my desk, there was a small box wrapped with a red ribbon. I thought it was a prank from my colleagues, so I opened it without much thought. Inside, there was an old black and white photo of a little girl holding a doll. There was no note, no indication of who could have left it there. Confused, I showed it to some colleagues, but no one knew anything about it. I found it odd but went on with my day. I thought maybe it was a bad joke or a mistake. But that was just the beginning. In the following days, I started finding more gifts. A porcelain doll with a broken face, an old mirror with dark stains, and always without any note or explanation. The discomfort began to grow inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about who was doing this and why. And then, I started noticing Mark. He worked on the same floor as me, but in a different department. He was always quiet, kind of reserved, but suddenly I saw him everywhere. In the hallway, in the break room, even in the parking lot. And he always looked at me in a strange way, as if he knew something I didn't. I tried to ignore it, continue with my work, but the feeling of being watched only increased. Fear began to consume me, and with each new gift that appeared, I felt a chill down my spine. Something was very wrong, and I knew I had to find out what it was before it was too late. The gifts kept appearing, each one more disturbing than the last. One morning, I found a note under my keyboard with just one handwritten word, "C." There was no signature, but the handwriting was crooked and hurried, as if it had been written in a moment of great emotion or tension. I felt a chill inside, looking around, hoping someone would explain that it was all just a bad joke. But the office was quiet, with people focused on their tasks, indifferent to my growing despair. That afternoon, while trying to concentrate on work, I felt as if someone was watching me. I looked up and there was Mark across the room, staring at me with an intense gaze. When our eyes met, he didn't look away, he didn't blink. There was something in that look that made me shiver, something that wasn't normal. It was as if he wanted to tell me something, but the words got lost along the way. Increasingly worried, I started paying more attention to him. Mark always arrived and left at the same time as me, always positioned himself so he could see me, no matter where I was in the room. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice was low and calm, but his eyes were disturbingly empty. I decided I needed to do something about it. I tried changing my schedule, avoiding being alone in the office when he was there. But that only made things worse. The gifts became daily. One night, I found a larger box on my desk. Inside, there was an old dress, stained and torn, as if it had been ripped off someone by force. The feeling of terror completely overwhelmed me. I could no longer ignore that I was being stalked. That's when I decided to go to HR. I explained everything that was happening, showed the gifts, the notes. But their reaction wasn't what I expected. They advised me to document everything but said that without more evidence, they couldn't take any concrete action. I felt alone, helpless, and incredibly vulnerable. The company that was supposed to be my safe place seemed to have abandoned me in a dark maze with my stalker. Now, with every step I take, I feel like I'm walking deeper into this nightmare. And somehow, I needed to find a way out before it was too late. After the discouraging response from HR, I decided to take more drastic measures to avoid Mark. I started changing my schedule, having lunch at different times, using the stairs instead of the elevator, anything to avoid running into him. But it seemed that the more I tried to hide, the more he made a point of appearing in front of me, as if he enjoyed my growing fear. On a particularly tense afternoon, I decided to go out for coffee far from the office. I needed to clear my head. As soon as I turned the corner, I saw Mark standing in front of the cafe I frequented, looking directly at me with that same disturbing gaze. My heart raced, and without thinking twice, I turned around and went back to the office. I didn't get my coffee and couldn't eat lunch. Mark was affecting not only my sense of security but also my health. That night, when I finally got home, my mind was racing. I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I called a friend, Jessica, and told her everything that was happening. She was horrified and insisted I stay with her for a few days. Relief and gratitude mixed with my anxiety. For the first time in weeks, I felt that maybe I could have a peaceful night. But when I woke up the next morning at Jessica's house, I found an envelope under the door. Inside, there was a note with a single sentence that chilled my soul. "You cannot escape me." The handwriting was the same as the previous notes. How did he know where I was? How had he found me so quickly? At that moment, the reality of the danger I was facing became clearer and more terrifying than ever. Desperate, I went back to HR with the new note. This time, they couldn't ignore what was happening. My voice trembled as I explained that Mark was following me outside of work, that he knew where I was even when I tried to hide. Fear was written in every word I said, and finally, they seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. They promised to investigate more seriously and to talk to Mark. In the meantime, they gave me a few days off so I could calm down and stay away from the office. I knew this was only a temporary measure, a brief respite before I had to face reality again. But at least for those days, I could try to regain some peace, far from Mark's watchful eyes. During the days I was on leave, I tried to do everything I could to forget the situation at work. I stayed at Jessica's house, and she made sure I was never alone at any moment. We talked a lot, watched movies to distract ourselves, but anxiety was always lurking, like a cold shadow in my heart. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow at the window made me run to check. No matter how hard I tried, the feeling of being watched never left me. One of those nights, we were watching a horror movie, ironically trying to laugh at our own fears, when my phone vibrated. It was an email with no subject, just a link. I clicked it, half distracted, and found myself on a page with a countdown timer. The background of the page was a photo of Jessica's house, taken from outside that same night. The countdown showed less than 3 hours. I closed the laptop so hard it nearly broke. Jessica saw my pale face and knew immediately that something was very wrong. I showed her the email, and without hesitation, she grabbed the phone to call the police. While we waited, we locked all the doors and windows, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark, staring at the phone as if it were our only lifeline. The sound of our breathing seemed too loud, and every movement outside made us tremble. The police arrived and swept around the house, but found nothing. They advised us to stay locked in and report any suspicious activity. After they left, the silence in the house seemed to scream. Jessica clutched a baseball bat, and I could barely take my eyes off the clock, watching the minutes drag until the countdown ended. When it finally reached 0, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. With trembling hands, I answered, and a distorted voice said, "I hope you're enjoying your time, Amy. Don't forget, I'm always near." And then the call ended. We were paralyzed, feeling the threat invade every corner of the room. The next morning, with the sun streaming through the windows, everything seemed less threatening, but the truth was clear. No matter where I went, Mark would find me. The reality of my situation had become scarier than any horror movie because I was living that nightmare every waking moment. After that night of terror, I realized I couldn't keep running. I needed to face the problem head-on. With Jessica's support, I decided it was time to act more assertively. The next day, we returned to the company's HR department with all the documentation, emails, messages, security camera photos that Jessica had installed outside her house, and the call recording. Everything was submitted with a single request. Immediate action needed to be taken. The gravity of the situation finally seemed to hit the HR staff. They assured me they would handle the matter with the seriousness it deserved. A meeting with Mark was scheduled, and I was invited to attend, accompanied by a lawyer. Sitting in that cold and impersonal room, waiting for him to arrive, my heart was pounding so hard I could swear everyone heard it. Mark entered the room with his usual air of calm, which only made me more nervous. The HR representative began the conversation, presenting the facts and the evidence we had gathered. Mark listened, impassive. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was calm, almost cold. He denied everything, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that someone was trying to frame him. It was surreal to hear him say that, to see how he manipulated the situation to seem like the victim. But I was prepared. I played the recording of the call, his distorted voice speaking to me, and challenged him to explain it. For a moment, just for a moment, I saw something dark pass through his eyes, a contained rage. But he quickly composed himself and continued to deny everything. The meeting ended without a clear resolution. HR promised to investigate further and said preventive measures would be taken, such as keeping Mark away from me at work. It wasn't what I had hoped for, but it was a start. I left the room feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Relief for finally confronting Mark, but frustration knowing he was still around, perhaps watching, planning his next move. I knew things weren't resolved yet, that the fight wasn't over. But I also knew I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had friends, I had evidence, and now HR was aware. I was tired, yes, but I was ready to fight, to protect my life, my peace. After all, I deserved to live without fear, and I wouldn't give up until Mark was stopped. After the meeting, the following days passed in a blur of tension and precaution. HR had advised that Mark and I would have no direct contact until everything was resolved, which gave me some peace of mind, but the threat still lingered, lurking in the shadows. I changed my route to work, alternated between rides with friends and Uber trips, avoiding public transportation where I felt exposed. One night, while trying to relax and watch something on TV to distract myself, I started hearing strange noises coming from outside my apartment. Initially, I thought it was just my imagination, the stress making me hear things. But then, the sound of something scratching the door made me freeze on the couch. My first impulse was to grab my phone and call the police, but I hesitated, wondering if I was being paranoid. Deciding to investigate on my own, I picked up a flashlight and quietly walked to the door. The hallway was dark, with only the faint light from the street lamp outside seeping through the window cracks. I slowly opened the door, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in every part of my body. There was no one there. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it had just been my imagination. However, when I went back inside and closed the door, I noticed a thin envelope slipped underneath it. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper. It was another message from Mark, written with letters cut out from magazines, just like in suspense movies. "You think you can avoid me, but I'm closer than you think." Those words sent a chill down my spine, and the reality that he was still stalking me, despite all my precautions, fell over me like a dark shadow. This time, I didn't hesitate to call the police. They came, examined the envelope, collected fingerprints, and assured me they would increase surveillance in the area. I knew, however, that as long as Mark was free, I would never truly be safe. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, staring into the darkness of my room, listening to every sound, every whisper of the wind, and jumping at every shadow that moved. I was trapped in my own home, waiting and dreading Mark's next move. I knew there had to be a way to end this, to take back my life. But on that dark night, the solution seemed as distant as a star in the night sky. After the night I received the last threatening note, the police decided to take more decisive action. They finally began monitoring the building's security cameras and those in the surrounding area, looking for any sign of Mark. Meanwhile, I was practically confined to my apartment, feeling that something terrible could happen at any moment. One afternoon, while trying to distract myself with a book, the phone rang. It was a detective informing me that they had captured footage of Mark lurking around the building in the past few nights. My heart raced at the news. The detective said they needed more to take action, perhaps catching him in the act, but this information was already a partial relief. I decided that I couldn't live in this state of fear and uncertainty any longer. With the support of the police, we set a trap. I would go to the work parking lot at night, the time when the cameras had captured Mark's presence, and they would be waiting, ready to catch him. That night, as I walked to the parking lot, every shadow made me shiver. The dim lights barely illuminated the space, creating pockets of darkness where anything could hide. My heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo off the cold concrete. I reached the designated spot and waited. Minutes passed, each feeling like an eternity, until I heard footsteps. Slow, calculated, approaching. I took a deep breath, trying to control the panic rising inside me. Then, he appeared. Mark emerged from the shadows, his eyes fixed on me. There was something sinister in his gaze, a mix of anger and obsession that made my blood run cold. He began to speak, his voice a menacing whisper. "Amy, did you really think you could escape me? That you could fool me?" Before he could get any closer, the parking lot lights suddenly came on, and the police appeared from all sides, surrounding him. Mark tried to flee, but he was quickly apprehended. The adrenaline of the moment was overwhelming, and I could barely stand, feeling both relieved and terrified. Seeing Mark handcuffed and taken away by the police was an indescribable relief. I knew that night marked the end of a dark chapter in my life, but also the beginning of another, where I would have to rebuild my peace and confidence. As the police led him away, I remained in the parking lot, breathing in the cold night air, feeling for the first time in months a glimpse of freedom. In those first days after Mark's arrest, a sense of relief permeated every moment. After all, he was behind bars, and I could breathe knowing that justice was being served. However, the peace I had so desperately hoped for seemed fleeting. The memories of the past months still haunted my days and disturbed my nights. Even with Mark in jail, I jumped at the slightest noise, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. During the day, I tried to resume my routine, but the feeling of being watched never really left me. I knew I had to confront these fears, so I began seeing a therapist, trying to unravel and heal the emotional scars that the stalking had left. But it was on a quiet night, while trying to relax at home, that the true extent of Mark's legacy was revealed. The phone rang, interrupting the silence. When I answered, a distorted voice spoke on the other end. "Amy, you think it's over, but I will always be with you." Panic set in instantly. The call was a cruel reminder that Mark's influence still reached me, even from afar. I quickly hung up and called the police, who promised to trace the call. It didn't take long for them to discover that the call had been made from inside the prison. Mark had managed to get access to a phone. This incident was a harsh blow, showing that Mark's imprisonment was not the end of my journey to reclaim my peace. His darkness continued to extend beyond the prison walls, reaching into what I most wanted to protect, my tranquility. I then decided I would no longer be a victim. With the support of friends, family, and professionals, I began to take more active measures to protect my privacy and security. I installed security systems at home, changed my routines, and continued my therapy. Each step was difficult, but necessary to rebuild a sense of normalcy and control over my own life. With each passing day, I felt that I was fighting not just against the shadows of what Mark had done, but also against the fear he had implanted in me. This struggle wasn't visible to the outside world, but it was the most arduous and significant for me. I was determined not to let the terror that Mark brought into my life define my future. And although the journey was long and filled with challenges, I knew I was on the path to reclaiming my strength and my voice, which had been shaken but never destroyed. Months had passed since Mark's last disturbing call, and life began to take on a new rhythm. I still lived with a caution that past events had instilled in me, but now there was a renewed strength in every step I took. The ongoing support from friends and therapy helped me rebuild not just my routine, but my confidence as well.
If you enjoyed these stories, you can't miss the story of I Am. 4 years ago, on a dark night in Texas, I Am, a veteran truck driver, encountered something terrifying on a deserted road. Scattered clothes, children's screams, and masked figures turned his route into a living nightmare. If you want to find out what really happened when I Am stopped that fateful night, don't miss this chilling account of a deadly trap in the shadows of the road. To see the conclusion of this story, I'll leave it here in the card, or you can check out the previous video on this channel. Stay brave and